Welcome. We are so glad that you joined us for the Power of Questioning, Part 1. I am Paula Lutzi, and I am a GrapeSEED Professional Learning Specialist. Today, Julie Baxa is going to give you an inside look at the power of questioning, including types and techniques. Julie has over 20 years of elementary classroom teaching experience, including having been a reading recovery teacher. She is currently a professional learning specialist and supports teachers in their journey to help students develop oral language as a bridge to reading and writing. Julie is also working towards her PhD in reading and language arts. This session is interactive, so you will be able to use the blue chat bubble to write in questions and comments. With that being said, I would like to introduce you to Julie Baxa.
Thanks, Paula. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. The focus of our webinar today will be on using the comprehension strategy of questioning, including different types and techniques. As Paula mentioned, this will be an interactive session where you'll have the opportunity to participate and brainstorm different types of questions that we'll be learning about during the webinar. Questioning is the strategy that propels readers forward. When readers have questions, they're less likely to abandon text. When one question is answered, another one usually arises. The more students learn to ask questions, the more sophisticated their questions become. Readers should spontaneously and purposefully ask questions before reading, during reading, and after reading. In addition to honing your own questioning techniques, consider teaching your students how to ask questions as well. Questioning occurs in all aspects of life and in all fields. New learning often occurs as the result of questions being asked. Research was done about asking questions. Borick did some research and found out that 80% of classroom talk is about asking questions. And some teachers ask more than 100 questions per hour. Therefore, if the process of asking questions is so popular, we have to make sure that we are skillfully and intentionally using this strategy. Every question that we ask should have a purpose, and that purpose is often more than just determining what knowledge students know. We want to help students expand their knowledge, to think creatively, and to think outside the box. So let's talk about the purpose of asking questions. First and foremost, questioning helps kids stay engaged in their learning. This is true if kids are the ones asking questions or they're the ones answering the questions. In addition, by giving children the opportunity to answer questions, we're affirming that we care about their thoughts and feelings. And students also have the opportunity with their peers to listen and hear different explanations and also different viewpoints from their friends. Listening to students' answers is also a great formative assessment, and it helps us pace our lessons. As a teacher, I can tell whether my students have learned the objectives of the lesson or whether I need to do some reteaching. So as human beings, we are driven to make sense of our world, and asking questions opens doors to our understanding. People ask questions for a variety of reasons. One is to clear up confusions that they might have. Another is to analyze a situation. Sometimes we ask questions to learn about other people and deepen our friendships. And other times we ask questions to explain our ever-changing world. But in some families, children are taught not to ask questions, especially ask questions of adults. And so as teachers, we'll need to help these students reawaken the ability to ask questions and really celebrate these questions in our classrooms. There are many different types of questions, but for our purposes today, we're going to begin with two basic types of questions and sort of build from the ground up. Two types of questions that all teachers ask are literal or closed questions, and then also open-ended questions. Both types of questions are needed for comprehension. Closed questions or literal questions are often referred to as within the text questions or right there questions. And open-ended questions might also be called beyond the text questions or about the text questions. So let's talk a little bit about each type of question. If you live in a state that uses the Common Core state standards, you might know that closed or literal or right there questions are what Standard 1 focuses the most on. Closed questions imply that the teacher has a predetermined correct response in mind. These types of questions are about recalling facts, and students can actually go back into the text and underline or highlight their answer. At first, when reading a new story or introducing a new topic, you may ask more literal questions. Your questions will focus more on making sure that the children know what vocabulary words mean, for example, particularly if you're working with English language learners or young students. You might ask questions about characters, like who were the characters in the story, or which animal climbed the tree. They're very closed questions, and often students can answer closed or literal questions with one or two words. So if you have English language learners in your classroom, or again, very young students, they may really generate interest for those children who might have more difficulty in expanding on language. Open-ended questions are, again, from the Common Core state standards. If you're in a state that uses those, these are standards 2 through 10. And open-ended questions require students to think beyond the text or about the text. Open-ended questions ask students to be able to retell the main events in the story or connect the story to their own lives. These types of questions require students to understand the story at a deeper level. Also, open-ended questions cannot be answered with one or two words. These are questions that students have to extend their language in order to be able to answer. It's important for us as teachers to plan a variety of questions, both literal and open-ended. Literal questions help us confirm comprehension and generally will fall into this knowledge level of critical thinking, that lowest level. These questions, again, help our students that are English language learners or our low language students feel successful and be able to participate without having to use very complex language. However, we can't stop there. We need students to eventually move to the comprehension level where they are expected to be able to restate or describe or explain what they're learning. We also want children to be able to apply their knowledge and to give examples or demonstrate or illustrate their learning. Children should also be able to compare and contrast characters, for example, in the analysis level of critical thinking. They should be able to examine different settings, problems, and solutions. Finally, we'll need children to be able to synthesize and evaluate. We ask children to do these when we ask them to give their opinion about a story or when we ask them to support it with evidence. Or we might ask children to think about how they would rewrite the end of a story. We need to help children think critically through these higher levels of questioning, even if we have to scaffold their thought process along the way. So let's have some practice. Here's the part where you get to be interactive with us. I'm going to read the story, The Spider's Web, and then we'll practice creating some questions. Now, you may never have heard the story, The Spider's Web, before, so knowing that you need to be able to remember some of the details of the story in order to ask good questions, you may want to jot down a couple notes about the story as I read. Here is The Spider's Web. Hello, little ant. Come dance with me on my web. No, my father says ants must never touch your web. So the ant went to work with his little ant friends. Hello, ladybug. Come dance with me on my web. No, my father says ladybugs must never touch your web. So the ladybug went to play with her ladybug friends. Hello, caterpillar. Come dance with me on my web. No, my father says caterpillars must never touch your web. So the caterpillar went to eat with his caterpillar friends. Hello, grasshopper. Come dance with me on my web. No, my father says grasshoppers must never touch your web. But you love to jump, and on my web you can jump up high. The little grasshopper looked and looked. He did like to jump, and it would be so much fun to jump on the spider's web. So he jumped. Aha! Jump, grasshopper, jump. My web will not let you go. Help! Called the grasshopper. Father, mother, help me. They cannot help you, said the spider. You have been a bad little bug. All little bugs know they cannot touch my web. I will help you, said a very nice friend. But good little bugs must listen to their father and mother. You can work with an ant. You can play with a ladybug. You can fly with a dragonfly. You can eat with a caterpillar. But you must never, never dance with a spider. So let's work together to try it and create some questions. Let's think about what kind of questions we could ask to check for comprehension. So we're going to use the story, The Spider's Web, and we're going to ask some literal questions first, or right there questions, since we would generally ask those first after reading a new story or introducing a new topic. So first, I'll model. One question that I could ask is, does the grasshopper jump with the spider? Another literal question is, who saves the grasshopper? So if the boys and girls don't remember, we can flip back to that page and find evidence in the text. So if you'll go ahead and type in the blue chat bubble one literal question about the spider's web, and I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, so someone just submitted, what kind of bug jumped on the web? Someone else just submitted, what did the spider want the insects to do? Someone else just submitted, what did the bird say to the grasshopper? And one more person submitted, name some of the bugs that did not jump on the web. Good. Okay, so I think you've got literal questions. Let's move on. This time we're going to try to ask some open-ended questions. So I'll go ahead and model first. I might say to my children, boys and girls, in the story The Spider's Web, the spider was asking the bugs to do something that they knew was wrong. Have you ever told someone no when they asked you to do something that you knew was wrong? Tell us about that. You can see I'm asking the children to make a text-to-self connection about the story, which is a much higher level question than asking a literal question. So go ahead, let's try it. Let's enter some open-ended questions in the chat box or bubble. Oh, good, you've been doing it while I'm talking. So here's one. What lesson did the grasshopper learn? Another one was submitted. What other stories have we read where the character was saved? And here's another one. Why do you think the spider would want the bugs to do something that was disobedient? And here's another one. Why have the fathers told their little bugs not to jump on the spider's web? One more. Why do you think the bird would save the grasshopper? 2 people actually submitted that question. Nice. All right, well, let's keep going. Thank you for your participation. Awesome questions. Every good story includes essential story elements, and it's important to discuss these elements with children and ask questions to gauge students' understanding. The story elements, of course, we know are characters, setting, problem, events, and solution. And again, these are included in Common Core State Standards 2 through 10. Questions about story elements can be asked with both literal and open-ended questions depending on the age and language abilities of your students. For our EL students, our English language learners, we want to be sure to provide picture support by turning back to the page that we're asking our question about. We might also allow children to come up and point to a picture to answer a question, even if they don't have the language to be able to answer on their own. And you'll change from literal questions to open-ended over time. So let's look at some literal questions about characters. Who were the characters in the story? We could go back and we could look right in the story and identify all of the characters. Some open-ended questions are, what kind of character was Tanya, for example? And we could teach children to go back into the story and give evidence. That could be based on the character's actions. It could be based on the character's dialogue. It could be based on the character's feelings. We might also ask about how particular characters feel, and then later in the story, how did they feel and what caused him or her to change. Again, we want to see change over time, and that's especially important for children who are in grades 2 and 3, as that, again, becomes part of the Common Core. Where did the story take place is a literal recall fact from the story, whereas why did the story take place there is much higher level. It allows for different answers from different students, as well as how would the story change if the setting changed. In the case of the spider's web, for example, how would the story change if the setting had been changed to a beehive? Would the little bugs have gone in the beehive? Again, EL students might need some extra support, and you might need to show a picture of a beehive in order to scaffold this type of question. Being able to identify what the problem was might be a little trickier, but still is a literal question. And one scaffold that we can give boys and girls is to narrow the question down to particular characters by asking, what did Pete want to do? Or why was Tanya having trouble? And that may help children successfully identify the problem. We know that children experience lots of their own problems in their very young lives, and giving them the chance to make text-to-self connections certainly helps them identify with characters and make an emotional connection to the story, which research has shown increases both engagement and motivation to read. In order to get young children to be able to identify the events in a story, it might be helpful to use pictures from the story to sequence, especially, again, for our English language learners or our youngest students. Using this type of scaffold gives children the pictorial support that they need to be able to identify the events. As children progress in their ability to identify events and retell in order, you might consider using abstract props, such as a rope with several knots in it that children can touch as they retell each event in the story. Open-ended questions will often get at the why events happened. Again, this can be difficult for young children. So start with literal questions and build up to open-ended questions about events, because children will have a difficult time discussing why an event occurred if they don't know that that event happened to begin with. Again, just like with the problem, some children may have difficulty identifying the solution. If this is the case, use specific literal questions about the characters to scaffold children's thinking. So you could ask questions like, what did Tanya do when the milk spilled? Children often have great ideas about how they would have solved the problem differently than it was solved in the story by the author. So capitalize on these times and have children use them during writer's workshop, for example, to write their own ending for a story. So again, let's try creating some questions about different story elements. This time, we're still going to use the spider's web, but you'll get to choose if you want to ask a literal or open-ended question. And this time, we're going to ask questions about the characters. My question is an open-ended question, and it's a higher-level critical thinking question of analysis. Would you want to be the spider's friend? Why or why not? So go ahead in the blue chat bubble, write your question about characters, and if you'll please identify it as literal or open-ended. Question already came in. If you were the hummingbird, would you have helped or would you have minded your own business? And that's an open-ended question. Here's another open-ended question. Why did the spider want the insects to dance in his web? Ooh. And again, you could go back and look at the text evidence for that. You may have noticed that the spider was holding a fork and a knife and had a napkin wrapped around his neck. So even though it's open-ended and children could give lots of answers, there was also some textual clues about that. Good. Another one. This is a literal question. What did the ladybug do when the spider asked her to dance on the web? And why did she do that? Good, thanks. Okay, let's move on. This time we're going to ask some questions about the setting. So, for example, my question is, how would the story have changed if there were animals instead of bugs and the setting was the ocean? So someone trying to get the animals to go into the ocean. That's an open-ended question, asking for analysis about setting. So if you'll please write your questions about setting into the chat bubble and identify it as either literal or open-ended. Someone entered a literal question. Where did the story take place? Yep, we have to start there. We have to know that kids know what setting is and where the actual story took place. Good. Here's another one. How would the story have changed if it took place in the winter? Nice. Another open-ended question. And here's another one. Why did the story have to take place on the spider's web in order to make sense? Again, an open-ended question. All right, one more trying it section here. So this time we're going to write questions about the problem. So my question about the problem is a literal question, and it is name the characters that were part of the problem. So again, we could go right back in the text and we could find evidence for which characters were part of the problem. If you'll please enter your questions about the problem and either identify it as literal or open-ended. Here's one. What was the spider's problem in the story? That's an open-ended question. Oh, two people said the actual same thing. What is the spider's problem? Good. Well, I know that this is the first time that you heard this story, and so trying to ask questions about a story that just went by quickly, we can see wasn't necessarily an easy thing for all of us to do. So it just goes to show how important repeated readings are for children. Every time we read a story or go through a topic again, boys and girls learn more and more every time. Children love repetition, and if we want them to be able to ask questions or answer them, they need to be familiar with the topic or the story. I use lots of different resources to prepare for today's webinar, and here are a list of the references. I just want you to know that you'll be sent a link to the recording of this webinar in the next few days. So if you'd like to listen again, you're more than welcome to listen again and then practice asking those different types of questions. I want to thank each and every one of you for attending today. Here is my email address. If you would like to contact me and ask me any questions about today's webinar, I'm happy to answer and help out in any way. Next week on Thursday at 4:30 p.m., we'll be having another webinar on questioning part 2. If you enjoyed today's, please join for next week as well, and let your friends know that they don't have to be in attendance for today's part 1 in order to attend part 2. There's no prerequisite or anything like that. So thank you very much for attending, and I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. I'm going to give it back to Paula now.
Thanks, Julie, for sharing about the power of questioning. That is all the time we have. We hope you learned how questioning can help your children, and please remember to join us for part 2 on March 8th. Following the webinar, there will be a quick survey to gather your feedback. We would appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to answer the questions. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.